This panel is the data implications of platform APIs, and we're going to add SDKs to that. And we have a very, very, very fascinating panel, actually, today. We have a few people that I'm going to introduce first, and similar to our first panel, I will introduce our panelists, and then we will jump into our questions. And after that, we will have a Q&A from the audience. So I guess we'll start down on the end right there. Morgan Reed has returned. For those of you that don't know Morgan, I'll read your intro again just in case. But I'll cut it down a little briefer. Morgan is the executive director of the Association for Competitive Technology. Morgan Reed is also an iOS developer as well, and so he's
Linux and iOS.
Linux and iOS. So he's very familiar with some of the issues that we're going to address today, not just from his role in terms of the ACT, but also as a developer who's had his kind of hands dirty and dealing with the issues directly. Next to Morgan Reed, we have Allison Hendricks. Allison is the platform policy manager at Facebook. She's an attorney, but she's not practicing. Is that correct? She's not in the legal team at Facebook. Rather, her work is much more as a mediator, as she kind of balances all of the stakeholders both within Facebook and outside of it with respect to their platform. I don't know if there's anything else to add to that. You want to add to that?
Oh, that was accurate.
Okay. And then we have, last but definitely not least, Jim Brock of privacychoice.org. So Jim is the founder and fearless leader of privacychoice.org. He was the co-founder and CEO at Attributor. And before that, he was senior vice president, communications and consumer services at Yahoo Incorporated. And in a past life, he was an attorney as well, although he no longer practices. So we have 3 attorneys up here, but nobody practices, so we should be safe. I think that's fine. For Privacy Choice provides a single privacy dashboard to manage privacy settings across Facebook, Google, and thousands of sites and trackers. Privacy Fix also checks your privacy status in real time as you visit sites and alerts you to data breaches and policy changes.
Yeah, and we also have a resource center for developers and a place where you can go get a privacy policy and learn about what you have to do to comply with it in about 15 minutes.
Yeah, those of you who survived this long, Jim is actually here to give you the solution to all that stuff you heard about. I guess this is the reward, the gold star.
One of the goals of this workshop is to drill down and start to provide some implementable tools and resources for the audience and actually those who are following online. And one nice thing about this panel is we kind of wrap it up with something that we touched upon in the very first panel this morning, and that is this IP stack versus the legal stack, as it were, in the conflict that can occur. This panel is going to talk about APIs and SDKs. We kind of added that into it because of the importance of it. And what we have here is we're talking about information kind of being pulled, or data rather, being pulled back and forth when developers are building the programs. So some of this is a bit on the back end, but it's something that's incredibly important and useful for people to understand. So kind of jumping into this, we'll just go right into it. Let's just start. I want to start with the risks, actually. Just so we have a kind of a set boundary of what are the concerns, why is this important? And so the first thing that I'd like to talk about, and we're going to combine APIs and SDKs, so feel free to have some expanded conversation here, is what are 2 to 3 technical aspects every developer should be thinking about when they're using third-party APIs and SDKs? And we talked about this a little bit before. That's where I'd like to start. Start from your left.
Sure. Right. Well, the biggest risk you have, setting aside for a second the trust of your users, is that she may bounce you if you don't comply. And she means not just Facebook, but Apple, Google Play. Anywhere you want to have an app distributed is going to have terms and conditions, and those terms and conditions apply to the data that you bring in either directly or via API. If you have API data coming in, particularly personal data about people, their identity, their picture, all the stuff you talked about today, it doesn't come without strings. It comes with a lot of strings. Some of the most basic being that you have to give the user, in almost every case, the ability to remove it. That's part of the Facebook requirement, for example. And the biggest risk you face then is ultimately whether your app will be distributed and can be used. Of course, there's also a trust risk with the user, and there's the opportunity cost of not being able to establish a relationship with the user that makes them want to continue to use your product, to use your app, or to take your other products and apps. So I'd say if we're talking first about risks, those are the primary ones that you would face as a developer.
And thank you for touching on that. Enforcement obviously is something that you do risk if you are violating the terms of service. Another thing is and expanding on the user piece is, you need to be aware of what it is that you're collecting or what it is that you're receiving by making use of the APIs and SDKs. And so a lack of awareness brings inherent in that risk that you might be violating any applicable laws or regulations, any policies associated with the platform that you're using, who's offering up those APIs. And then the top line is just, again, setting the right expectations. You risk losing user trust in your brand, your product, your service. So you could compromise yourself as well, and the integrity of people and their faith in your product.
So there's another aspect of this on the risk side. How many of you using free SDKs, or how many of you have ever gone to or used free, this has got a lot of echo to it, free SDK, downloaded? Okay, I see some hands. How do you think those folks are monetizing that SDK? They're collecting information, right? I mean, how else are they making money? Somebody's got to eat. So the other part of this you have to consider as you're drawing from free software development kits is they almost always include lines that say that basically everything we collect is our property, including any of the intellectual property that flows from that. So on the SDK front, I think the reason that we need to remember that it's APIs and SDKs is a push me, pull you, right? If you're the developer and you're making a request to Facebook and you're tying into their API, you kind of know you're doing it. Getting a lot of boom. You know you're doing it, right? You're making that call. You're making an intention to make the call to Facebook to draw that information. Sometimes when you download a software development kit, the call to Facebook or someone else's SDK, API is happening absent your direct decision to incorporate that data request. So when you're thinking about it, you kind of need to know what's happening. When on the API front, you just heard what the risk is, right? You'll get bounced, you won't get approved, there'll be problems. But I think you also have to think of it this way. I am sure that whatever app you're developing is the coolest, most amazing, unique, first time anyone's ever thought of doing XYZ in the entire history of mankind. Well, okay, so why did you just hand over, we just said earlier data is really critical. Be thoughtful about that, because all that data you sent over just went to somebody else who can monetize that data maybe in exactly the same way you are. Unless you patented it, hey, it's mine too. So remember, as you look at the API calls that you're making, the ones that are intentional, that you make that request for, you need to comply with the law. On the SDK side, you need to know what they're taking, because they're taking it from you and ultimately your users. So on both counts, I think you need to be aware.
And let me add to that, if I can, that this is all knowable. There's no real mystery about what the SDKs do. And when we talk about SDKs, that could include a bit of functionality that makes your app cool. That could include an advertising call. That could include analytics. That could include any number of things that power your app and make it better or make you more effective. We have one tool that we put up for demonstration at Privacy Choice, where if you have an iOS app, you can go into the tool on a self-serve basis and run your app across our proxy. We will decode the network traffic for you and tell you which companies, out of about 1,200 that we monitor who are in those businesses, which companies are actually taking calls through the server requests that are happening, and how big the files are, and other good information about that. And if you look on the website at privacychoice.org under Scan Your App, you'll even see an example. And we picked one that was particularly illustrative because it's a medical app where you might be searching for a medical condition. And if you actually go into the report that we created for that app, you'll see that the condition the person is searching for is transmitted to the advertising companies. And that may be for the purpose of targeting ads more relevant, and there are some rules around that the better companies comply with. But the fact is, you have enabled the sharing of a medical condition from the app. And that may or may not be okay with the user. It's really up to them. The question is Is it transparent, and have you disclosed that to them in a meaningful way so they know that? But until you know that, until you know what's going across the wire, you don't really know how the SDKs are behaving, because no matter what the code says, they're going to touch someone else's server, as Morgan says, and that's just a fact. And in that case, you're transmitting data, and you should understand what you're transmitting on behalf of the user. So check out that tool, and if you have an iOS app, give it a run and see what's in there, and hopefully you won't be surprised. If there's something you don't expect, you track it down, you figure it out, and you remove it if you need to, or you disclose it.
One other point that I forgot to mention is, in addition to complying with our policies with respect to Facebook, again, speaking to, is which require you only request the information that you need in order to provide that user with that good user experience. So setting aside the fact that that's a policy requirement, you're also risking losing users. So if you ask for too much information, then that dialogue can get scarier to that user, because again, it's very transparent what it is that you're requesting. And the user's going to see all these different data points, and it's going to freak them out, and they're going to want to not install your application and see that great application that you've built and that experience that you want to provide. So even if you're inadvertently asking for more than what you need, again, number one, it's against policy to do so, but number two, you risk not having as many people actually experience your app because they will cancel out and won't install it.
You raise a great point. I'll use an I/O example of exactly the problem you're raising. There's an app, it's called White Noise. Anyone familiar with it? It's TM Soft, it's white noise. Anyway, Todd, who writes it, if you do it on iOS, he basically needs to make a call to monitor the state. What it is an app that plays white noise, background white noise like the ocean or, you know, seashell type noises, so that you can have your headphones on and less outside distraction. On iOS, and I'm not violating my NDA on this. Obviously, you can make a call that allows you to monitor the state of the phone in iOS. So what iOS does is essentially it cuts off any app when the phone rings. Android doesn't. Android requires him to essentially be monitoring the state of the phone at all times and essentially acting as though he were recording every phone call. So what's burned him is, if you look, because the way that Google does it, which is essentially, you know, you have the text file and you kind of vomit forth every possible incident that could happen. You know, that their privacy dashboard isn't particularly, I wouldn't say it's informative from the point of making a consumer understand what's happening. It just says all the possible outcomes that could happen. So he's got all these negative reviews on his app that are saying that he's monitoring phone calls. Well, I actually looked at what he's doing. He's not recording people's phone calls. There's no other way to do a save state on what the phone is doing so he can turn the white noise off when the phone rings. So her example is exactly true. People have given him 1-star ratings, having no idea what's happening, simply because when they look at the Google Privacy Dashboard, it says he's monitoring the phone call. So she's right. If there is a programming reason that you need to make that thing, you've got to get in front of that with a why. Because if you don't, you get 1-star ratings. And we know how much that hurts your revenue model in any app store. 1-stars are deadly. So be aware of that aspects of what you said in terms of scaring a user. We all know when we go to Facebook and it says, this app would like to do the following 6 or 7 things. I will admit, as taking off my developer hat, user hat, it's a little frightening, some of those. I mean, they're hard to feel what they're going to do. And so I'm sure that if we looked at the numbers, you're going to see people saying no to apps because of those.
And the platforms are getting better about giving you the opportunity to explain what's really going on.
That's right.
And say, no, we're not monitoring your phone calls. Or, you know, when we've looked at the Facebook API, for example, you have a choice. Do you want that data to come to your server, or whatever process you're running with it can operate in the browser without ever leaving the browser? And so when the browser closes, the data are gone. You should say that, and in a sense, wear the badge proudly that says, hey, we have a minimal data footprint. We only bring over to our server the information that we truly need to operate the service. I know that is absolutely contrary to the developer instinct, which is, it's data, it doesn't cost anything to store, why would I throw it away? So you have to counter that impulse in this space, in this privacy sphere that we're in now, and make those decisions and say, look, no, it doesn't actually have to go to the server. It can reside in the browser, and the user never has to share their data with us. And then the question is, how can I get that message across? Apple now allows you to program some of the statements that are in the contextual notices that happen. Android's not as good on that yet. Facebook and others, they're making places in their app store interfaces and their app marketplaces to allow you to explain these things. And if you get that 1-star rating, I mean, that's incredibly difficult to deal with. We've dealt with the same thing ourselves. You have to get in there and put it at the top and say, hey, this is exactly what this app does. And hopefully, fast forward a year from now, and the app platforms will be much better about giving you an opportunity to explain in more detail what you actually do, because they do care. And the folks out there who do care are vocal, even if they're a small percentage. They're very vocal, and they do influence downloads.
So we've touched upon, actually, all three of you touched on a little bit, the difference between the platforms. And that can be very difficult for smaller and independent developers. So you kind of have a two-part question here. The first part is, or maybe three, what are some of the differences? How can developers maybe find out where those differences are to make sure that they conform with everything? And then finally, do we see maybe some industry standards starting to emerge? It might be easier, and we'll start with that one, but do we see some industry standards starting to emerge where Google and Facebook and Apple, for example, are all starting to kind of move in the same direction to make it easier on developers so that you don't have to worry about the different information that's going on here versus there versus here versus there?
I think we were just talking about this in the room. I think a lot of it comes down to the business models that the companies have. On the platform side, Apple is a hardware company, right? I mean, they don't give away their software, but essentially the software is something that empowers your craving, crack addict desire to buy things with Apple logos on it. Microsoft is a software company, right? They dabble in hardware, but really they make money on seat license sales. That's where their profit comes from. Google is an advertising company. They're not a tech company so much as their 98% of their revenue is for advertising. So that obviously influences the way, as a developer, I approach that platform. Apple, another hallway conversation was about how Apple had kicked an app off the platform kind of just ad hoc. Because ultimately, they don't really monetize. That's not the huge part of their profit. Their profit comes from making people want these devices with an incredible level of desire. And so if kicking off one app torques a bunch of developers off, sure, Ronak Emoto and the developer relations group will hear about it, but Phil Schiller won't care. Tim Cook won't care. So Apple has a very different attitude. Microsoft is very much, we want to keep developers happy, remember, sweaty, developers. That's true. Microsoft is a developer-focused company. They want to keep developers happy. They're definitely much more willing to work with it from that platform perspective. Google is an advertising, eyeball monetizing company, so their interest is a little different. And that's why we end up with the Google Play scenario, which, if you're not aware of it as developers, you need to be. I don't know that it's going to burn us. It might, but it's reached into the regulators that if you guys have Android apps, if you have pay-for Android apps, you know that you receive the first and last name, email address, and what amounts to the physical address of every single purchaser of your application. And you know that Google does not allow anonymous ratings anymore, or reviews of apps. So that means you essentially know that guy by name who gave you a 1-star rating, and you could drive to his house and egg it if you wanted to. That's bad, right? So remember that when you're thinking about the platform differences and what you collect, you get a lot of information with Google, which is awesome, but that also gives you a lot of responsibility with what you have to do with that and how you have to keep it. So if you are currently taking down all the stream of data that you get off of your Google Wallet store information and dumping it into a spreadsheet, and you're turning those people into your customer database, be aware. Do you think those people know that happened? So as a developer, when you talk about what the differences are, Apple will kick you off, right? They just want to sell hardware. Microsoft, they want to figure out how to make you happy and sell more seat licenses. Google's much more about information flow. How much data can come in, how much data can go out, how much of you heard it in that earlier panel, the in and out of the data flow. So be really careful as a developer that, the fire hose you drink from on the data flow that you're on is going to be influenced by the platform you're working on. The quickest thing is just look at the output when you sell an app. Apple gives you basically this graph that shows you what country and no other information. Microsoft gives you almost no information. BlackBerry gives you no information on your user. Google, pretty cool. I know like everything but their credit card number from a Google Play transaction. Think about that. Big difference.
I'll limit my response mostly to the policies. I think the good news is that because I do read over the different policies across the platforms, and it makes me happy to see that there's a lot of common themes, and that makes it easier for you as developers, where you can see, okay, all of these respective platforms are requiring me to disclose what it is that I collect, what it is that what am I doing? They are all requiring compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, common themes across not surprising the user, being transparent, trustworthiness is the key. And so I feel that although you're developing across platforms, when it comes to policy, a commonality is that you are seeing, especially in the privacy realm, common expectations around disclosures and setting right expectations with users.
Let me say a word about the advertising side of this, the advertising SDK and APIs, only because it's unbelievably complicated and getting more complicated every single day. But one thing to think about in that area, if you have ad-supported apps, is to understand what techniques they're using to identify devices and users. And that's shifting a lot because Apple has said, at least formally, that you have to rely for advertising only on the advertising ID, this new thing that came out. And yet, if you actually look at all the advertising companies and what they're doing, a very small number of them actually now comply with that. The big ones do. Google AdMob, they've actually literally switched over. But if you're working with advertising companies that are not in the upper echelon, you may find that they're relying on techniques to identify devices that are no longer permitted on iOS. They are no longer permitted. I'd be absolutely clear about that. Because we have do not track essentially on iOS devices now. The user can find it deep in the settings. They can turn that off. Right? Victory. The problem is if you work with the lower echelon or even the middle tier, you're going to find a lot of companies who aren't really complying with that. And it remains to be seen whether Apple's going to kick people out for doing that. The fact is, you request consent on behalf of the user for these interactions, not just for yourself as a developer, but also for the advertisers you bring to the party. That's a fact, and that's the way the structure works. So get on top of that. Now, we do at Privacy Choice have an index with about 1,200 companies. You can just look up the domain and understand the privacy qualifications of those companies. And you can do your homework if you want to put a little bit of time into it. The second point about the advertising economy is look out for the shapeshifters. Flurry obviously is strongest and grew up in analytics, and they're one of the most popular packages out there. But they've now announced that they're actually in real-time bidding, and they're a full-on advertising company. And if you look at the two calls they make and what they do, you can't tell those apart. So you need to understand in your contract with these companies what they can and can't do with the data. So if you see the press release where Flurry says, we've got data on 300 million devices, you have to understand, okay, is that data in a silo, or is that data being shared across apps for the purpose of more relevant advertising? It may not be a bad thing that that's true, but as a developer, you have to kind of understand that, because you're going to have to turn around and tell your user what's going on, because that is your responsibility, right? So it's complicated, getting more complicated, and be careful every time you pull an SDK in for ads to understand what's really going on.
Now I want to stick up for Flurry. Flurry's not bad. In fact, we were just having this discussion. They've actually don't permit kids apps on Flurry just to avoid this exact problem, which is a conundrum we face, which is how do you find a quality analytics package at a really low price for kids apps? So, but Jim's exactly right. They're an advertising network. They have a pretty sweet analytics tool that allows benchmarking, which is, as a developer, I love the benchmarking aspects of this. But you're right, they have to get paid somehow. All of us in the developer world should ask, why is Flurry giving me this powerful analytics tool for free? Somebody's getting paid. What's the rule if you go to a poker game and you ask who the mark is? If you have to ask it, then you know that you're the mark. Same thing here. If you have to ask who the customer is, well, you know, that's probably you then.
So kind of building off that, and actually I wanted to ask about analytics in general. What are some of the concerns maybe about some of the analytical tools, or analytics tools, excuse me, that people are introducing into the mobile devices and their platforms? But we can jump beyond that a little bit and say, what are maybe 2 to 3 concerns or 2 to 3 things that developers should keep in mind when using these other party SDKs primarily, especially?
I'll do a couple quick ones. You guys will have more too, I'm sure. Look for the logo and the label of the industry programs. And I'm a critic of those programs in many ways, but if you don't see that the company is involved with the Network Advertising Initiative or with the Digital Advertising Alliance or the OTA, whatever these are, if you don't see those labels, you need to dig even deeper. Those labels are there for you, really, to understand more quickly whether this company's in the good guy category or the maybe not a good guy category. So that's probably the first thing you do, because those guys have principles. Some of those organizations actually do compliance reviews, even though they don't really do mobile yet. They're getting into that. So you can tie yourself to their program a little bit in that. And I think the other thing is, just repeat what I said before, look at what your app does across the proxy, right? You need to do that. You need to understand what the traffic is that's emanating from your app. That's just obvious to me, and we give you a tool for that on iOS, but if you don't do that, I think you're probably not doing what you should for the user.
So the top of mind for me is just to make sure that any analytics provider or company that you're using is respecting the data that users entrust to us and that they entrust to you to it's just as strong of a degree. And that you understand that any data that you enable them to collect is done so on a confidential, like on an absolute contractual obligation to keep that data siloed on an app-specific basis, and that they're not enabling third or fourth parties to access that information. So the analytics, that's the key, is making sure that your analytics provider is also adhering to the terms that you're subject to and that you've committed to. And that's what's coming to, I might have another comment after if you want to expand on that, or, but that's the real key there, is just making sure that the data policies and the data flow is being adhered to across the board.
I think she raises a really good point, which is, you know, we joke about if you can't be found on Google, you don't exist. Well, anymore, if you can't be found on Facebook, you don't exist. And the terms and services that you've signed up with Facebook are pretty critical. Facebook requires you have a privacy policy. Facebook requires that you agree to some terms on the way that you'll treat the user data that you collect through the Facebook API. You do not want to get bumped. You do not want Aaron Egan or somebody from your group to kick you off the Facebook platform. You're dead. I mean, that's the end of you if you can't be found in those places. So there's that aspect. I will say that what you have to look at is what are you driving for from an analytics package. If your analytics package is to provide UX feedback, user experience feedback, where are my users stalling out? What are the tools that are part of my application that people are using the most? There's obviously some free packages. Frankly, if you're any good, you can write some of that yourself. You're still collecting it, but what you're really after on it is the benchmarking. How do I fit in the world? Where is my success? How are my competitors doing? How long are people spending on me versus my competitor? So you know that by definition, the questions that I'm asking, those comparison questions involve collecting quite a bit of data and having it somewhat uniquely identified to all the users. So there are some pay-for analytics services, and they're pretty darn good packages. The odd thing is, doing good benchmarking requires more data. And it tends that the free packages do a better job with benchmarking simply because they collect more data. So as you're looking at what you're doing out of your analytics package, if you're building it in for long-term benchmarking, profitability, how quickly do you monetize consumer, how do you transition them to an in-app purchase versus do they just purchase once, how much time do they spend, and then you want to see those numbers against your competitor, you might want a mix of free and paid. You might want to do some of it with a free app, limit some of what you take. Some of them allow you to actually turn off features. I know that Flurry actually allows you to turn off some of it. And then look at a paid for some of the more intrusive stuff you want to know so that you control your data. And again, I'd say that not so you don't get busted by the FTC, but you should control the more valuable data because it's an asset of your company. It's something that if you do want to get acquired, it might be something that you can sell. And if you've collected it in the right way and you've protected it in the right way and you've covered all the bases, it goes into your, I can get paid for this. So again, look at it being able to do a mixture of free and paid analytics, and be willing to write some of it yourself. If you don't have the skills to do it, I understand it's a pain in the butt. I'm a network stack guy, so I'm kind of used to looking at packet network information. But if you're not, get somebody who does. Buy them a beer. Get somebody who knows how to use Charles Proxy and set it up. It's worth it.
So we've touched upon the risks here a little bit, and we're going to move into opportunities, because I think that's an important aspect of today, is not just talking about the challenges. But 3 quick takeaways just from listening to the panel that I have for those in the audience. 1, read the fine print. I think that seems to be a clue about where is your data going. 2, if you're using an SDK and it's free, ask why. Where are they using that data? Where are they sharing that data? And 3, proxy test, which I think will take us right into the next set of questions or set of discussion, and that is, what are the opportunities that exist? And this is also kind of a 2-part question. And so what are some of the problems you see that can be solved? So this isn't a risk factor. This is saying, look, this is something that'd be great. We heard Jonathan say earlier today, privacy as a service. Like, he wanted that kind of a solution set. Are there things that you see in the space that could fit in that? Obviously, we talk about privacy choice. And the second part of that, are there any companies that you've noticed have been successful in building a business around this already, as an example, so people can kind of have an idea about it? You want to start that?
You can do that technically. You can know when someone's uninstalled a Facebook app, and you should. Best practice would be to go ahead and deep six that information from your database. That's the right thing to do. And when a company steps up to doing that, I feel better about using that company's services. So I view that as a real opportunity. The overall opportunity is the more careful and deliberate you are about the use of data, the more comfortable you can be using more and more and more of it from different companies, from different APIs. And what is cool about this time that we're living in as humans is that it's all coming together, and we've got these giant companies who are falling all over themselves to please us every day and to do incredible things for us every day. And that's a great time to live in, and it also is a great time to develop software in. And there's so much data you can use that if you get the framework right, as I said earlier, if you get the culture right within your organization, then you can feel even more empowered to go and do more and to bring more data in and put it to work on behalf of the user. And that's the exciting part. That's, for me, that's the opportunity, ultimately. That's what's great.
Yeah, just to echo Jim, when you build out your user interface such that you're speaking to me and I am installing your application and you're giving me what appears, accurate disclosures around what it is that you're collecting and how your application works, building out that user experience where that initial flow is really telling me what it is, why I'm here, and what value it is that you're going to bring. That just increases my trust in what it is that, the service that is that you're providing. And again, then you get the re-engagement, the users will come back. So that's more of the value. The opportunity by adhering to these laws and or the policies that we put in place, they're not in place to be guardrails to really prevent your innovation. To Attorney General Harris's point earlier, these can really be blend and go hand in hand. We're trying to help you improve that user experience and improve that user trust, increase, maintain engagement within the context of your application and their experience within Facebook. So, those are the things that are really top of mind for me with respect to why the privacy piece is important. The earlier panel alluded to a different sort of area of privacy. We've been focusing on the data that's being collected or requested of the user, but also thinking of privacy within the context of sharing. And making sure, again, the opportunities when you build out these really explicit sharing options, when you're making it incredibly clear as to why you're encouraging this person to share this information back onto Facebook with their friends, or just onto their own timeline with the only me setting, so that they can store that memory for something they want to look back and be proud of even just on their own. Building out that flow such that there's no surprises. I really like the packet, and I haven't thoroughly read it, but Attorney General Harris gave us all a packet today, and if you look, she has this emphasis on no surprises. And that's really what we need to be building for. You really love what you've built. You love your application. You want everyone to use it. And we want you to be successful. I mean, Doug Purdy, our platform product director, developer love, we really genuinely love developers, and we want you to succeed. Because literally that helps improve the user experience for everyone, the entire ecosystem. So don't think of privacy as an inconvenience. It could actually serve to set you apart and distinguish you from someone who's providing a similar service but who has not shown you and demonstrated that they care enough to let you know what it is that they're doing with your information.
So you got to have some controversy. I'm going to disagree with Jim a little bit here.
Won't be the first time.
No, and it won't be the first time. I will warn you to be careful with the delete on delete or delete on depermission. And I also tell you, you should exercise it within the confines of how Facebook allows you to do it. But be very careful about overpromising your user that you're doing it, number one. And number two, understand your user experience. I know for a fact that my daughter has erased apps on my iPhone that contained data that were accidental. I've also rebooted and rebuilt several iOS devices and other devices. And if my data had been deleted simply because I had accidentally deleted it, I'd have been pissed. And you don't want a pissed off user coming at you and you telling them, well, you deleted it, so I thought you wanted me to erase all your data. So be really careful.
I was just talking about when they revoke permission.
Right. Be very careful about the revoking, because people change their mind, right? People go in and out on location. We talked about it earlier. So I guess this is why I'm a little conflicted here, because I think about the way that people operate. They treat privacy much more situationally, right? Right now, I want this level. I want to revoke permissions now because I'm either in a place emotionally, physically, or otherwise where I don't really want this to a larger audience. Later, I want an outpouring of sharing. So look at the data that you're taking as discrete data pieces, and with regards to it, obviously obey the wishes of your user. Geez, definitely. But be careful by willy-nilly trying to reach the privacy brass ring and dump data. So I guess I don't think we're disagreeing, but I think that's where
at some point it's got to be deleted.
Yeah. Well,
give them a week.
To Charles's point, what opportunities do we have in this area? We have an opportunity right here. Let's strike the balance. Let's find out what is the best practice with respect to data retention. Again, Facebook policy requires that you delete it upon request of the user. Yep. I mean, that is key to keep it. But there's also laws and regulations out there that require retention. And so we need to do a good point of figuring out, what is the right balance, what is the right policy in that place, and have that conversation. Is it a week? Is it a few months? I absolutely agree with you that I might deactivate inadvertently an account, and you notice that Facebook just told you that the user removed the application, and then I go, oh no, okay, I'm gonna go install it. I didn't mean to do that. And then all of the content that I had curated and produced, whether it's my activity within the context of a game, is now gone, and I have to start over. So those are the kind of things we should think about.
And
so
every app's going to be different.
Yeah.
Right? Every app will be different in terms of how you approach that issue of retention. But it is an issue.
Mostly I just want to make some controversy. It's late in the day.
Yeah, and an opportunity.
You guys awake?
It's an opportunity for us to have a dialogue on that and figure out what's the right balance.
So actually what I'd like to do, based on this, I'd like to actually talk to the audience and see if there are questions. If people have questions in the audience, I know it's later in the day. But did someone see a hand? Oh, we do have a hand back there. I'm sorry.
Well, there's not much in this country anyway. There are some relatively strong self-regulatory bodies out there that have principles and so forth, and most of the big guys are in there. And there's a lot of discussion about regulations like do not track. So I think most of the legislative regulatory effort has been put behind the idea that there should be an off button for tracking, but that's landed everyone into this morass of what that really means and how is it enforced and so on and so forth. And so, the short answer is there isn't really any.
Well, there is. It's around unfair and deceptive, right? If they don't lie, if what they're doing isn't deceptive, then there are limits to what can be done. Advertising is a First Amendment right, and in fact, FTC Commissioner Maureen Olhausen can give you chapter and verse of constitutional law that preserves the right of advertisers to reach customers. So as far as the FTC's head people are concerned, advertising is a First Amendment right. Now that differs when you start talking kids, but it's worth noting that COPPA was for a long time held by the Federal Trade Commission's group that deals with advertising. It has now moved. COPPA is no longer under the advertising group. It is now under the privacy group. So it's interesting you raise the point. It used to be regulated by the people who regulate advertisers. It's now regulated by the people who regulate privacy. Yep. Well, those are two different things. There's there's DMA's privacy guidelines. There's everybody the best practices guidelines, and we all actually have worked on them. And Facebook, we actually work with Facebook on some of this stuff with Aaron and Rob and some of the people on their privacy team. And Jim has been a participant in some of the work that we've done on self-regulatory around kids. There are lots and lots of good best practices documents. DMA, IAB, GSMA, CTIA, acronym soups have them. The multi-stakeholder thing, the one that you mentioned, which is multi-stakeholder, that's the NTIA process. That has actually not yet resulted in any kind of final. Yeah, I can barely hear you, I'm sorry. Yeah, IAB has been part of the, we've been working with IAB on this stuff.
But here's the statistic, right, which is there's about 1,200 companies in and around the space. There's about 150 that are in any of those organizations. Now, they do represent a very large market share, but as a developer, this is for developers, you need to make sure you know whether those organizations are in there or not. And the mobile stuff is still in early stage. It's still wet clay, and there's no consensus around what those standards are.
But I'd agree with you. IAB stuff is very much worth looking at. They've got an office in New York that's dedicated to the mobile stuff that IAB is working on, and they've got people that are working on best practices around this from the advertising perspective. So I definitely look, we definitely spend a lot of time talking to IAB and others about what are best practices around this. So it's a great point and a good suggestion to look at what's going on there.
My startup is combining crowdfunding with universities' back-end systems. And so we're in a really awkward space from a privacy perspective in that you have enterprise-level interests clashing with consumer behavior, right? Users are getting on our platform and they're interacting with each other and they're becoming friends and they're building networks. And so in that sense, we very much take the attitude of we're going to do a lot of UX-level analysis, but our data control is very much around what we know about each other. Yeah. But then they're sharing things that the institutions that we're building these platforms for kind of believe they have a right to, and we already know that their approach is to go stalk public records, right, and learn everything they can about something. And so kind of caught between the ad concern discussion going on and the very real reality of the fact that universities used to be able to know a lot more about people than they do today. And the addresses and phone numbers and all that has changed. So what I guess I'm looking for is, are you guys aware of enterprise applications that have a consumer-facing element? I do like gamification, right, of user spaces, and privacy issues that are there. Can you direct me to people that might be good to talk to?
So, do you integrate with the Facebook platform with respect to your application, or?
We do. I mean,
so,
right, because almost everyone that's how they're identifying themselves.
I don't have, so my knowledge is limited. It's very expertise focused with respect to what our policies are. And so I'm able to speak on guidance with respect to who you can work with. We certainly, and this may actually be non-responsive to your question, so I'll apologize in advance, but For the benefit of the room, to the extent you integrate and receive information from us that users grant you access to, we still place restrictions on transfer, and we still have expectations around use. So once the user grants you access to that information, there's still obligations to, for example, never share, even in aggregate or anonymous form, that information with a data broker or an advertising or monetization-related tool set or ad network, for example. So you need to make sure that, again, to the point of the data that you're collecting, that you are making sure it's secured and not being exposed and or transferred to people that we place restrictions on.
If I can give a quick response to this, I think it will be helpful for others that are in any space like mine. We're doing best practices analysis. We're inventing what it means for higher education to fundraise today versus 20 years ago, right? No one wants a phone call anymore. So in that sense, we're absolutely aggregating profile-based information because most of what we do is affinity-based. Sharing that with colleagues is how they bug their users less and create a better community experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to be really clear, like, we're inordinately obsessed with privacy, right?
Thank you.
We're working with state-level institutions, and we're also working with people's donations, which often have political ramifications. So we're super sensitive about the transactions and the personal information, and the goal here is to create very tight-knit, very close, think pack level communities, right? Like small, tight communities that the enterprise has awareness and the ability to interact with in culturally inside the cultural context they're creating.
Well, it's ironic you mentioned political because I think most of this is out there in the public, but if you read Sasha Eisenberg's book about the victory, it's the victory something, Eisenberg's book about the Obama, the victory, thank you, I think it was Sarah, thank you, Sarah. And if you've ever worked in DC in politics, the Democrats have something called the vans, or van, checking out the van. People will use that as shorthand. Oh, I'm going to look it up on the van. Wow. The van knows everything about you. If you've ever told someone what your religion is, that's in the van. It tells how many times a visitor has come to your house during an election cycle. It says when you fill out the form for the van, if you've ever gone door to door, you fill out a form that goes into the van. So forever and anon, they know how you responded to what questions that were presented to you by whomever visited your door. They know which email you responded to in terms of economically, which one caused you to give. Was it a guns issue one? Was it a women's issues one? The van is incredibly powerful, and it's kind of what you're talking about. What's interesting is political giving is absent is not covered on a lot of the existing privacy laws. So the interesting part about this is that members of Congress actually do share their data lists and sell them to other people. So if you've given to one person, you will find that you are getting requests from others. That's because they sell the data. So there isn't a lack of familiarity in the political circles with how this stuff works.
Go ahead.
So just be aware. So yes, these things are actually a big time issue in the fundraising circles. How do I do it? How do I run a van? How do I run van absent the non-political? I think you're raising really valid points, and I wish I could point you to a piece of software that could solve your problem. We haven't written it yet.
We're working on writing it.
Then let's.
Then let's. And I'm going to use this opportunity just to remind everyone that no data obtained from Facebook can ever be sold. Period, whether in aggregate or anonymous form. And so if you're integrating with us for the purpose of monetizing that data and selling that information, that's a full stop no. We want you to integrate with us to provide a great user experience and help expand and facilitate our mission to make the world more open and connected and give people the power to share. And if that is not why you're integrating with our platform, and you're integrating for the purposes of selling data to someone else, that is not, that's against our terms and not how we want people integrating with us clearly.
That's a very good point.
I just had a point on that point. So this is a great example
So let me just clarify. Everyone is subject to all applicable laws and regulations. Okay, so setting that aside, if you are independently collecting information from user, the activity that is taking place within the context of your app, and we aren't talking about data that was obtained from Facebook, that's as between you and that user, but I guarantee you, our policies still require that you don't mislead, surprise, confuse, defraud that user, but to the extent I'm manually typing in information to you, and your privacy policy and or any explicit dialogues disclose to me what it is that you're going to do with that information, that's between you and the user and the laws of which you're subject to wherever you make your application available. So that was a very good point. I just wanted to expand on that because not everyone could probably hear you. But thank you.
A practical consumer application, right? Someone builds this into their platform, someone shares on Facebook, and what they want to be able to say is, we helped more people share more things on Facebook as a proof point that what they do as a company is worthwhile. Does that make you uncomfortable? The idea that they can, in aggregate, say, we've increased your institution's activity on Facebook?
Just for the benefit of the broader audience, I'm going to take this offline. To the extent I'm still around afterwards, we can speak. Thank you.
So let's just do one last question. Go ahead.
I have a question about anonymous activity monitoring. Just kind of what's the current state of the art of people thinking for mobile? If you, obviously a lot of websites just know generally how people are using the website and activity. I notice on a lot of desktop applications, it's common now to ask, hey, are you okay if we share your anonymous usage information? Mobile, you never get asked that question. My presumption is a lot of apps are sharing how often people are running the app, what features they're using in the app, and they'll all be anonymous. They're not asking for permission to do this. That seems to be the kind of standard, as long as it's in your privacy policy, that's a reasonable thing to do. But I'm curious what you all think about that.
Jim?
Well, obviously, it's all about disclosure. It's also all about how you define anonymous, and there are, titans battling over this question of anonymous, pseudonymous, all these different terms, right? And is a unique device identifier anonymous? Does it become anonymous when it's hashed? What are all these different layers to it? So I would not offer a general answer to that, except to say, in every case and circumstance, you're going to have to look at what's really going on and what's being shared. And in general, in this country anyway, the prevailing rule is that if it is truly anonymous, certainly if it's not associated with a specific device or device identifier, then generally speaking, people feel free to share that. Now, the issue is where that dividing line really is and what that definition really is, and whether or not the standards they talk about is it reasonably possible to re-identify that device or that human being. And what that means is subject to a lot of interesting discussion as well. You're closer to that than I am, so.
Any last
No,
comments?
I think Jim kind of
Yeah.
hit a lot of it on the head. There's what does anonymous mean, and what are you doing with it, and how are you behaving with it in an anonymous fashion? No, I think we saw that with the carrier IQ issue, and Apple endured multiple congressional hearings and other things because they were storing map information on the device itself. They weren't even pushing it back, and the whole issue about map server, you saw the kerfuffle that all of that created around mapping, which arguably was unique once it was divided away from the device identifier, and yet it was still something that triggered a lot of sensitivity. So I think you're right. I think people are very careful about claiming anonymity with mobile because it's almost always tied to location, and we've determined that location plus anything equals knowing.
So with that final question, or final point, I'll do 3 kind of quick takeaways before we wrap this up that I took away. The first is to think about where you're sharing data, especially as developers. We've talked about consumers a lot today. This last panel is very much more focused on the developer data, using other APIs and SDKs. So really think about that. If it's free, why is it free again? A second thing is there are tools out there. You can use them. We have a great example right here. So there is no reason not to try. There's no reason not to try to look for a little bit deeper, push a little bit farther, and see what can help you. And then finally, just to keep a little bit of conflict for the end of the day, advertising still seems to be a bit of a conflict point about where people are generating money and where that's heading, and where that can create some conflict of interest even between platforms, developers, third-party analytics, and so on and so forth, as we talked about tonight with the other self-regulating bodies, for example, that are trying to figure out different systems in this, and that is not yet finalized, and that's going to keep developing, as you pointed out, with the mobile as well. So with that said, I'd like to thank our panel very much.
Thank you, Charles.
And I'd like to take a quick second to say thank you to Joan McNabb. I think she's coming up in here. And of course, to thank all of you for attending this very long day, but we found it very useful, and we hope you did too. And if you have a chance, please find me. I always love speaking with entrepreneurs out there. Thank you.
And thanks to all the speakers and all the supporters who made this possible, and to all of you who stuck it out to the very end. I hope you found this helpful. In the Attorney General's office, we don't consider this the end of the conversation. We're happy to remain in dialogue with you. Please keep in touch, and if you want my card, I will give it to you. And have a good ride to wherever you're riding to now. Bye-bye.